for this episode of Mr. Nailsin's Wednesday Comics. I'll start off with the indie comic that I backed on Indiegogo, and keeping with Halloween-themed aspects of this month in October, as I tape this, I will do my review and overlook of Jack the Ripper, Vampire Hunter. Now, this was a project by Mandy Summers, who probably know her from the Toxic Femininity show on Midnight's Edge. She was a frequent panelist on there, and was constantly talking about her comic book projects, and so I checked it out and decided to back it. I like Mandy. She's funny and all that sort of stuff, and I'm actually probably more looking forward to Gymshock. Of course, it's more superhero oriented, and it's very much a callback to the 90s sexy woman superhero aspect of titles like Witchblade and that sort of thing, and all of that. But also a fan of horror films and whatnot, so horror comics are also a good thing. But boy, I tell you, this is one of those things where the question, too soon? And we would say, well, no, it's over 100 years ago with the Jack the Ripper murders. But the title pretty much tells you what the deal is here. And I didn't realize, I thought this was a one-shot deal, that there might have been a follow-up. But no, it's a to-be-continued thing. So, but as it is with the presentation here, Jack the Ripper was misunderstood. He was hunting vampires and all that. So, of course, this is fictional. So it's like, it's not that big of a deal. It's just like, it's one of those things of the too soon question is like, no, it's very old, and you move on with historical figures being used in all kinds of fantasy tales and science fiction and whatnot, doing things and saying things that they never really did, and it certainly stretches credibility as to whether or not the actual personality of these people would have actually performed the way they did in a given scenario that certain genres of fiction put them in. Here, well, what other genre could you put Jack the Ripper in but horror? But he's not necessarily the villain. And so it's this sort of take. I mean, you wouldn't do, Ted Bundy Vampire Hunter. You wouldn't do that. I would hope not ever. But that's the thing that's like, well, is this horrific serial killer from the turn of the century, and all of that, and crimes that were never solved, although I suspect that if we look this up, Charles Lechmere was a prime candidate for the identity of Jack the Ripper. But that's the real story. So I don't know, I mean, you can even go through Star Trek, where they had an alien entity was Jack the Ripper, who possessed one body after another and lived on, and this sort of thing, and all of that. So is it that something to be that upset or disturbed by? Well, to each their own, I guess. But it's been over a century, so but anyway, it's not a comedy. This is a horror, sort of something of a superhero, in that Jack the Ripper has an outfit and a mask, and one has to conclude that there's something off with him. So he's battling vampires. He's been infected by them, so he's struggling to fight off turning into one of them, and that sort of thing. As per aspects of horror, not necessarily my favorite of the horror genres of more gore and anything. I don't think more times it's gore and nothing else. There's a lot of gore in here. It does involve Jack the Ripper, of course, and what did he do given the time, and finally, his final victim really showed what he wanted to do, which is basically completely beyond dissect his victims, completely eviscerate them. And so in this, he's, well, dissecting vampires who don't die and all that sort of thing. And his experiments in trying to figure out how to combat vampirism. And there's been other vampire stories where this has happened, where they tried to come up with a scientific method by which you can offset whatever this weird supernatural viral infection of vampirism is, that it does to people who die at the hands of vampires and all that. So basically you've got probably another title could have been Jack the Ripper versus Dracula, because for all intents and purposes the main villain vampire here, referred to as the Master, it's Dracula, and it coming to London and all that, but instead of facing off against Van Helsing, faces off against Jack the Ripper, unless the ultimate reveal is that it's Van Helsing who's being called Jack the Ripper. I don't know. There's references to the actual Jack the Ripper story, but it's shown off as like this could be an entirely different guy. Perhaps there was a real Jack the Ripper in this world, and this guy's just getting the blame for it. There's a detective in here. I'm guessing there'll be more of him in the follow-up. He's sort of introduced, and then it just shifts to Jack the Ripper. Don't know if that flows exactly as it should. The artwork is good, and thank God it's black and white, because, boy, the gore. But it's more akin to illustration of a textual story, whereas some of the sequential flow is not quite there, and sometimes it is, but I mean it's kind of in between there. And so Dracula could have been the one. I could have called him. I mean, Dracula is public domain, so just about anybody can have Dracula show up in their book, and this is more. The depiction of Dracula, or the Master, is much closer to old folklore and to the Bram Stoker vision of what Dracula really looked like. And the story does suggest that he's so old and stuff that he no longer bears any resemblance to human beings, whereas his ladies of the night, literally, and they're all sexy and gorgeous and everything. Except when the blood starts flowing, then it's like, oh, geez. But nevertheless, they're recent vampire converts, and so they still have their beauty and whatnot. So it's all very fantastical in a lot of ways, but then again, it's a vampire story, so no fault there. I guess the look of it might have been, if it had been closer to the art styles of the illustrations in Penny Dreadfuls, to more capture the era. That might have been an interesting take on it. But the one interesting thing to it is that the odd thing, I guess, you're having Jack the Ripper be your protagonist here, and he's still incredibly disturbing, as one might expect, and his sanity is certainly, if not completely gone, deeply broken. And of course the story posits this is his battle with the vampires has done this to him. But it is that interesting aspect of thinking, well, he's the guy who's basically the Batman of this world and all that, and yet he's so incredibly messed up. And so there is that. I guess ultimately the detective involved in this story perhaps would become the actual hero of it, and maybe they'll pursue that in the follow-up. He's the Jim Gordon. I don't know. But anyway, it is a to be continued story, and so I don't know. I'll have to think about whether give it another shot. But I'm thinking Gymshock might be the better one of the two projects. But it's hard to say. Haven't really read that one either. And the payoff for the next volume of this might save the day for this pursuit. Well, there's been a lot of upset in the world of Star Trek over the past few years because of Bad Robot and Secret Hideout. Yeah. And so the one last ditch effort to save the whole endeavor was to do a Captain Pike series, and they did. They called it Strange New Worlds, and wasn't really any good. A lot of people praise it because it's better than STD and Picard, easily. It's episodic and all that sort of thing, but it just wasn't very good, and some things were just blatantly stupid. And of course, it doesn't respect the material. It doesn't respect the timeline. If they would, they might as well just bite the bullet and admit that this is an alternate timeline. It does not. I saw a guy try to explain that this was the perfect prequel series to the original Star Trek series, and of course, his sponsor was a Star Trek video game. So there you go. That's the explanation for it. It's in no way that. So for comic book purposes, I remembered a comic book series and didn't get around to it, so decided now's the time to finally do a series in the 90s that Marvel did, detailing the adventures of Captain Pike. It was called Star Trek: The Early Voyages. And this series goes a long way to actually capture that era as much as possible. The phasers look like the phasers did in those days. They don't look like the ones Captain Kirk used throughout the original series, except for his pilot episode in Where No Man's Gone Before. Yeah, that one. They had some of the old, in the uniforms and everything. So you had that. You've got most of the main characters, and I've read the first issue, and I'm going to read as much of the series I can get my hands on. And we'll get back to it as we go. But in this first issue, there's a bit of a flashback. It's actually a forced flashback. The overall plot of this story, of Flesh of My Flesh, is something of a horror story. This monster captures Captain Pike and torments him because it's trying to learn all about him. And it completely just doesn't understand Captain Pike's resistance to being eaten. So it's truly an alien creature, but it's forcing him to relive his memories of becoming captain of the Enterprise and all that, and Robert April's in it and all this stuff. But all of that is within keeping of what was known at the time of the canon of Star Trek, and the comic book does a much better job at that than the television series of Strange New Worlds did, which didn't even really try. And Captain Pike actually gets to do something. He does not go into the kitchen and cook a barbecue or whatever. No, he gets captured. They have to rescue him and everything. But he's very much the captain of the ship and all of that. And, of course, in keeping with Star Trek, even though they've been attacked and by this monster and were going to be wiped out about it, they still feel bad that they had to defend themselves and ultimately kill it. But, it's like, hey, there could have been a better way, but there was no talking to these guys. They really just couldn't get it that we didn't want to be eaten, They're going like, hey, we'll all be one flesh because, you are what you eat. And Pike was like, no, thanks. No. And so there you are. Another aspect of it was, and I don't know how the series progresses, but the thing about doing a Pike series would have been with the deal with Mr. Spock. He's there. He's a member of the crew. That's all well established. But he's the type of character that would have been relegated to the position that a character like Chekhov or Sulu held on the original series. They're not going to be one of the main big three like Kirk, Spock, and McCoy were. This would be early days of Spock, and the reason for that is that the development of Spock progressed over the original series, but that's much later in time, so you really can't do a whole lot. You could do a couple episodes here and there where he's the main guy, has to solve a problem or whatever, and that sort of thing, and he's building up the friendship between him and Pike, because he clearly developed something there, because he really cared about the man when he went to rescue him in the original series and bring him back to Telos 4 so he could live out his days in that fantasy world rather than being trapped in that chair due to his injuries. And so but you can't have him be the main character and whatnot, even though he's the big star character-wise. But you got to have the skill in writing to develop Captain Pike and the other members and stuff like that. So, which they didn't really do with Strange New Worlds. That's unfortunate, but they didn't. But this series, at least in this issue, did. As first issues go, well, it's not the greatest thing since sliced bread, but it did do a far superior job on Trek lore and canon than any of the new shows did, certainly as far as it goes for prequel purposes. The only thing I could call into error, they did introduce other new characters that we just didn't know about. We didn't know who the engineer was and stuff like that. There's another alien on there, and that's fine. But Dr. Boyce is there, and I'm guessing this takes place before the Cage or something like that, because the way he's drawn, he looks much younger than Dr. Boyce really was, and he doesn't look anything like Dr. Boyce. So they have some adventure where Dr. Boyce was prematurely aged further or something. But well, what are you going to do? So it's pretty good, and of course, by comparison, which again is not necessarily that great of a compliment, but easily a far superior adaptation of a potential prequel series than Strange New Worlds was. So anyway, there's that. There's your Wednesday Comics with Mr. Nailsin, Star Trek, and Jack the Ripper Vampire Hunter. How about that? Of course, according to Star Trek, Jack the Ripper was possessed by an alien entity, so there is that. How about that? Okay. Anyway, we'll see you next time.